Tabletop RPG history. Back in the time of Mists, there were lots of people making their own entertainment with tabletop wargames. In practical terms, these are exactly the sort of military simulations that you still see played today, but mainly on computers. They were intricately detailed maps, spread out over tabletops across the world as counters, pieces, or fully detailed models were moved in massed ranks to defeat their implacable enemies. It was a glorious time. In parallel with this, there was a healthy interest in the crossover between fantasy and warfare. In case you think Tolkien invented fantasy literature, I have to point out that the Arthurian legends, Robin Hood, and the tales of Charlemagne's paladins and even Beowulf are all fantasy fiction. Now, there were wargame rules for fantasy play, with knights attacking fortified castles, just a small step away from actual medieval battle simulations. And in a small town in Wisconsin, there was a group of people who wanted to have a wargame that could be played for very small units, and where you were actually represented on the field by a figure. Over time, this figure became a great hero, much more powerful than the other units on the map. The rules they created were called chainmail, and I suspect they ended up with a handful of devoted players, as you might think, since the idea was both somewhat novel and very much tapped into a desire to explore a fantasy world. It wasn't enough for this intrepid band, however. They took the chainmail combat rules, attached a character development system, documented thousands of monsters and concepts from European folklore, and gave birth to the world's first role-playing game. And they were in a hurry. It was a race, as they well knew. There were many people in the process of developing RPGs at the time, but they had the advantage that they'd already published a game system. Chainmail, if you recall. So they could be quicker off the ground. They won the race, became household names in a very, very tiny number of households, and Dungeons & Dragons was released to almost universal apathy. This is, in fact, the story, or at least the beginning of the story, of just one of 3 games that we collectively know as Dungeons & Dragons. And it's important to know this because we're about to describe the game, and it's not necessarily exactly what you'd expect. Derived from a wargame, the purpose of the game was to win fights. Your players were intended to be collaborators, but also competitors. At its heart, this was a wargame, with maps, miniatures, enemies, and victory points. It's just that the players joined forces to fight an enemy controlled by an independent referee. The winner was the player who scored the most points, killed the most enemies, collected the best treasure. Character development was a largely arbitrary process, allowing the more experienced player to add new skills and equipment so the enemies they face would be tougher and more challenging. This, in fact, is the reason for one of the most pervasive jokes or complaints about the game. Playing a high-level character with lots of spells and magic items and the sort is challenging. It's probably even more so now, but it was challenging even back then. Because the decision had been taken to make the dragon the top monster in the game, it was only those who'd both created high-level characters and learnt how to play them who could ever face such a foe. Dungeons & Dragons, therefore, had dungeons galore, but dragons were out of most people's reach. The creators of D&D, Gary Gygax and Dave Arnson, assumed everyone would play with little miniatures of themselves, just like the wargame. They assumed that there were really only 2 types of challenge that would allow you to earn the critical points to win the day: traps and monsters. They assumed that everyone would play the game the way they did. It didn't matter. Most of the people who picked up D&D weren't dedicated wargamers. They saw something else in those rules. a way to live out the vicarious fantasies in their minds, not on a table. This first version of D&D essentially came out in two forms. Originally, in 1974, there was a set of small booklets in a white box, a format very familiar to early Traveller players. Subsequently, they rearranged the rules for ease of use and published them with a number of minor improvements in a single larger format booklet. This format also included the combat rules from Chainmail, so you no longer needed to own a copy of that game as well. It was this booklet form that was my first introduction to the game. The single booklet form went on sale in 1977 and was available in a basic box to get you started. That included an adventure module, B1. Basic 1. Over the next 2 years, Gygax would release a series of books for a very different game, though based on the same underpinnings, which he called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's probably shocking to people now, but the core rulebooks were not released together, but one at a time over much more than a year. The idea, at least in theory, was that the beginning player would carry their character over from the basic rules to the advanced rules after third level, which was as far as the basic rules went. If that was truly intended, then the concept disintegrated really quickly. The rules for advanced D&D were wildly incompatible with the basic rules derived from the original white boxes. They were also far better, far bigger, and made it much more practical to create competition-style adventure modules, which was, after all, one of the things that Gygax desperately wanted to do. For most D&D players, this era, between 1977, when the single booklet form and the monster manual was published, and could be used to diversify the challenges faced by the basic set players, and 1981, that period from 77 to 81 might be considered the first age of real D&D. The era covers the publication of the Player's Handbook in 78, the Dungeon Master's Guide in 79, and a very large number of modules to get you started. But in 1981, we saw the publication of the last of the three forms of the game, after that initial white box and then booklet form and the advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. It's worth noting that the game, as published now, and since the third edition, has essentially been derived from advanced D&D, not from this third form. But the last form was the second version of the basic D&D rules. It was actually intended to be a less complex form, as opposed to a simple introductory set to AD&D, and therefore was also entirely incompatible with AD&D rules, because reasons. It included the idea that once you'd progressed beyond the basic rules, there would be a second set, known as the expert set, that you could buy to extend your characters, and this set was compatible with the new basic rules. It was a huge hit, so much so that it wasn't much later in 1983 that the basic set was revamped and turned into a 5-set series. After exceeding the basic and expert set, there were the companion set, the master set, and the immortal set, still to come. This edition became known as the BtS6 set because of the initial letters of the 5 sets. I don't actually know, but I strongly suspect that the immortal set didn't really sell all that well. Partly because it was a fairly silly idea to take characters to the point where they were basically deities, but mainly because when in 1991 the Rules Cyclopedia was published, which essentially bound together all of the BtS6 rules in a single book, it seemed to completely forget the immortal rules altogether. And it was that Rules Cyclopedia that essentially drew a line underneath every version of D&D apart from Advanced D&D, or as we know it now, D&D. It wasn't until 1989 that the second edition of AD&D came out, and at that time the Beckme rules were still being sold and played extensively. For me, the most notable thing about the second edition, and the reason its entire existence was simply denied by my peer group, was because of the moral panics of the 1980s. I could do a whole piece on the story of those times. Younger people might find some of the intricacies impossible to believe, but the shorthand is that on both sides of the Atlantic there were conservative, small c, movements opposed to things that they considered to be degenerate. You know, like in Stalin's Soviet Union. During the Thatcher and Reagan era, these people found a ready ear in government, and these evildoers had a profound influence on all forms of art and creativity, like in Stalin's Soviet Union. They imported the concept of political correctness from old dictatorships, and imprisoned, hounded, fined, and even assaulted anyone they disagreed with. Under the reign of terror of these real monsters, even fairy tale monsters were forced to hide. So D&D's second edition deleted demons, devils, interracial breeding, and all sorts of other things that some random lunatic in rural Staffordshire or Texas might find objectionable. And my peers and I, we took a stand. We didn't buy the second edition. We hunted out banned movies and books. These days it probably seems like I'm overstating it, but I'm not kidding. It was a very dark time. But moving on to happier times. In 2000, Wizards of the Coast, now the owners of D&D, released the third edition. While I'm sure there's a lot to say about it, I'm afraid that I had lost contact with tabletop RPGs by that point, and I wouldn't come back to them for many years. So, there you have it. The early history of D&D. If people are interested, I'll do a piece on the modules that everyone played back in the day. For those who might want a helpful guide to which ones to use for throwback gaming or just for inspiration. Or, again, if there's interest, I'll happily tell the story of the moral panics of the 80s. There's a lot more to it than just what happened to D&D. I'm not really qualified to talk about the third or fourth editions of D&D, however, so please don't ask me to cover that. I didn't play them. Sorry. So, that's it for the evening. I hope you had some fun. Please do follow us at Boys Baltic on Twitter for updates on everything we're doing. Our next episode is tomorrow at 11 PM British time for the latest edition of our ongoing Traveller campaign, where our intrepid heroes are investigating a murder on a cruise ship in space. Then on Saturday night, also at 11, we're going to be doing another of our top 5 episodes. This time the word that inspires our lists is fish. I was not consulted. Many thanks indeed for watching, whether live or on demand, and I wish you all a very good night. Thank you.